The revolving glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital parted, and in stormed Jonathan Hayes, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. His tailored suit was flawless, his polished shoes clicking against the sterile floor, yet his eyes betrayed a tension no boardroom success could erase. Another checkup, another wasted hour, he thought, mind racing through spreadsheets, contracts, and looming deadlines. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic, a stark contrast to his world of mahogany desks and marble lobbies. As he navigated the waiting room, his gaze drifted, briefly catching a small boy sitting quietly on a chair. Frail, pale, yet with eyes that mirrored his own, the same mischievous glint he once had as a child. Jonathan froze, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. Something about the child was unsettlingly familiar. Their eyes met, and in that silent moment, a bridge between two worlds, one of wealth, one of vulnerability, was formed. The waiting room's antiseptic air did little to calm Jonathan Hayes' mind. He shifted impatiently in his chair, tapping his expensive watch, a sleek gold piece that had cost more than most people's monthly rent. Outside, the hospital corridors hummed with mundane life. Nurses wheeling carts, patients murmuring anxiously, the soft squeak of shoes against linoleum. To Jonathan, it was all chaos, a disorderly world that demanded efficiency he couldn't find here. As he stared at the ceiling tiles, his mind drifted, an involuntary montage of his life, a cinematic rewind to the path that had forged him into the formidable man everyone feared. He was 22, fresh out of Harvard, stepping into the boardroom of a fledgling tech company. He carried himself with an air of entitlement, his sharp suits and sharper tongue setting him apart. One of the first employees he met, a young, enthusiastic programmer named Lisa, pitched an innovative idea. Jonathan barely glanced up from his phone, a smirk forming. "Cute," he said dismissively, "but this isn't amateur hour. Stick to your code, leave strategy to me." Lisa's smile faltered, but she nodded, swallowing her disappointment. Jonathan's gaze swept across the room, already calculating. Every handshake, every glance, every minor interaction was either a stepping stone or an obstacle. There was no middle ground. A few years later, he was leading multi-million-dollar deals. His decisions were razor-sharp, but ruthless. Employees whispered about his temper and cutting remarks. One day, he walked past the janitor, Mr. Thompson, who was quietly mopping the marble floor in the lobby. "Careful with the wet floor, sir," Mr. Thompson said politely. Jonathan barely glanced down, brushing past him. "Hurry it up. People have places to be," he muttered without sincerity, his focus already on an incoming call about a hostile takeover. The janitor lowered his head, unseen and unacknowledged, a silent reminder of Jonathan's disregard for anyone who wasn't a part of his power equation. Boardrooms became his arena. Negotiations were battles. Every conversation was a contest to assert dominance. Employees learned to anticipate his moods, nodding, deflecting, agreeing, survival over innovation. Jonathan thrived in this environment, yet there was a subtle emptiness behind the triumphs, a void he ignored. The montage shifted again. Jonathan was alone in his penthouse late one night. The city lights painted the walls in muted golds and blues. He sat in front of a polished mahogany desk, surrounded by accolades and expensive art, but none of it seemed to matter. On the desk sat a small framed photograph, a young boy with unruly hair, bright eyes, and a wide, innocent grin. Jonathan's younger self. He picked it up, tracing the boy's face with a finger. Memories of simpler times flooded back. The first time he built a model airplane, the summer he spent fishing with his father, the nights he stayed up reading under a blanket, dreaming of adventure. In those moments, the world had been vast, yet intimate. Dreams had been limitless, and failure was only a lesson. The adult Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Those memories were fragile, tucked beneath layers of ambition and ego, buried under deadlines, contracts, and boardroom politics. But here, in the sterile hospital waiting room, glimpses of that lost child flickered to the surface. The boy in the photograph reminded him of someone, someone small, fragile, and completely unprotected. A sudden beeping from his phone snapped him back to the present. His assistant's message: "Boardroom crisis, immediate response required. Should I redirect calls?" He sighed, irritation and duty warring in his chest. The hospital, he reminded himself, was merely a detour. Yet his eyes wandered again to the child in the waiting room. Frail, pale, quiet, yet somehow alive in a way that his corporate empire could never nurture. Jonathan rose, smoothing his suit, and walked the hospital corridor with a subtle stiffness. His presence radiated authority even here. Nurses parted instinctively, visitors glanced, recognizing the sharpness in his posture, the precision in his movements. Yet despite the power he exuded, a small, uncomfortable tug gnawed at him, the echo of a humanity he'd long neglected. He paused near the hospital window, sunlight streaking across the linoleum, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny specters. For a moment, he imagined the world differently: less contracts, less strategy, less fear of failure, just connection, just presence, just being. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as a fleeting distraction. Focus, he reminded himself. There's work to be done, always work. But the child's image lingered in the corner of his vision, a reflection of something Jonathan had almost forgotten about himself. The resemblance was uncanny. The same sharp eyes, the same hint of mischief, the same vulnerability that no boardroom could ever disguise. It unsettled him, not because it was eerie, but because it forced him to confront a question he hadn't allowed himself to ask in decades. What have I become? With a final, impatient glance at the clock, Jonathan strode back into the waiting room. He adjusted his tie, straightened his posture, and put on the mask of authority that the world expected. Yet beneath that polished exterior, a spark of curiosity, of unease, even compassion, had been ignited. And in that quiet, fleeting moment, the stage was set. The child and the CEO existed in the same frame now, not just visually, but emotionally. Two lives intertwined by an uncanny resemblance, two paths destined to collide in a way that would challenge the very foundation of who Jonathan Hayes believed himself to be. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional distant chatter of nurses. A small boy, no older than 10, lay in bed with a thin blanket pulled up to his chest. His frame was fragile, almost skeletal, but his eyes burned with a brightness that seemed impossible for someone so ill. Despite the tubes and monitors tethering him to the sterile walls, he smiled whenever a nurse passed by or another patient waved from the hall. This was Alex, though no one in the hospital could yet imagine the story that fate had in store. There was a subtle symmetry between him and Jonathan Hayes, the same piercing eyes that seemed to notice everything, the mischievous curve of a smile that suggested intelligence and charm, even under duress. A nurse, handing him his medicine, paused with a soft smile. "Good morning, Alex. How's my favorite little patient today?" she asked. Alex's grin widened, and he tugged gently at the sleeve of his thin hospital gown. "Better than yesterday, I think. The lady next door said she'd let me borrow her storybook if I finish my exercises." Despite the frailty of his body, Alex moved with a quiet determination, pulling himself up on the edge of the bed to peek at the hallway. His world was small, defined by walls, routines, and occasional visitors, but he navigated it with empathy and curiosity. He noticed every detail: the worried glance of the janitor wiping floors, the fatigue in the eyes of the young nurse who had just come off a long shift. Without thinking, he offered a soft, "Good job," to the janitor as he passed. The man's face softened, a hint of gratitude returning where exhaustion had settled. Alex's perspective revealed a different kind of awareness than Jonathan's. He understood the small joys of life: soft blankets, a warm cup of soup, a visitor's smile, while also sensing the loneliness around him. He had become an observer of the world, quietly noting what others overlooked. In moments of playful mischief, he would peek at the ceiling tiles and imagine they were floating islands or invisible clouds, a small rebellion against the sterile, controlled reality of the hospital. Later, as a nurse wheeled another patient down the hall, Alex offered a piece of his storybook through the rails, saying, "Here, you can read this while I wait. Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on it." The simple act of kindness went unnoticed by most. But for Alex, these small gestures were how he measured the world, by what he could give, even with so little himself. From the hospital window, sunlight streamed in, glinting off his hair, highlighting the familiar arch of his brow and the intensity in his gaze. The resemblance to Jonathan Hayes was uncanny, almost eerie, yet Alex's aura was different, warm, fragile, unguarded. Where Jonathan's power came from dominance, Alex's presence emanated subtle influence, empathy, and a quiet insistence that the world mattered beyond ambition or wealth. Alex's thoughts often wandered to adventures he might have outside the hospital, to parks, to laughter with friends, and to summers he would never fully remember. Yet he did not dwell on sadness. He noticed kindness, celebrated small victories, and understood human fragility in ways few adults ever could. In his mind, the world was both harsh and beautiful, and he navigated it with a balance of courage and curiosity. Meanwhile, Alex glanced up from his bed, sensing movement near the corridor's entrance. A tall figure in an expensive suit strode by, posture rigid, eyes scanning the waiting room with impatience. For reasons he could not name, the boy's curiosity piqued. Something about the man's expression, the sharpness in his eyes, the subtle tension around his mouth, felt familiar yet distant. Alex tugged at his blanket, trying to sit straighter, straining to see the figure as he moved down the hallway. There was an unspoken pull between the two worlds, the sterile hospital walls and the fast-moving corridors of power outside. Fate, it seemed, had already begun its quiet orchestration. As the nurse called for Alex's therapy session, he swung his legs off the bed and carefully followed her into the common area. At the same time, Jonathan Hayes, leaving the waiting room after pacing and thinking, was drawn toward the same hall. Their paths, separated by circumstance until now, began to converge. Alex's eyes, wide and curious, met the figure approaching, his small heart beating with a mixture of innocence and intuition. And so, in the same corridor where wealth and vulnerability would collide, the boy and the CEO were drawn into a quiet gravitational pull. Neither could yet understand the depth of the connection, but the audience could sense the subtle tension, the reflection of one life in the other, the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves. Jonathan Hayes paused mid-step in the hospital corridor, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead cutting through the quiet rhythm of his thoughts. And then he saw him. The boy, Alex. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to slow. The kid's thin frame, the sharp glint in his eyes, the curve of his mischievous smile, they were like mirrors of Jonathan himself, only smaller, softer, more innocent. Jonathan's chest tightened. His normally unflappable demeanor wavered. His fingers twitched against the strap of his briefcase, and for a fleeting second he felt something unfamiliar, disbelief, tinged with panic. Alex, oblivious to the storm of recognition swirling in Jonathan's mind, waved a small hand at a nurse passing by. "Careful with that, Cart. You don't want anyone to trip." His voice, light and playful, carried an energy Jonathan hadn't felt in decades, a mixture of audacity and warmth. Jonathan swallowed, forcing a curt nod. Yes, very responsible," he muttered, his voice rough around the edges. The boy tilted his head, curious, his gaze unwavering. "You're not from around here, are you? You walk funny, like you're used to telling people what to do." Jonathan blinked, caught off guard. He had never been questioned like that, not by a boardroom adversary, not by a subordinate, not by anyone. I'm just visiting," he said, his tone clipped, trying to reclaim authority he no longer felt. Alex's eyes sparkled. "Visiting? That sounds important. Important people usually talk a lot, right? Do you talk a lot?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. The boy's simple curiosity had punctured the bubble of control he carried like armor. For the first time in years, he was being observed, not with fear or deference, but with innocent, unflinching attention. Cinematic close-ups captured Jonathan's reaction. The slight twitch of his brow, the tightening of his lips, the subtle fidget in his hands. His mind raced, flipping through memories, childhood fragments, and the uncanny reflection staring back at him. The resemblance was eerie, unsettling, yet magnetic. Alex, sensing the tension but unbothered, leaned slightly forward on the edge of his hospital bed. "You look kind of like someone I know, only older. Do you have a twin somewhere?" His tone was innocent, playful, but the weight of the words hit Jonathan with unexpected force. Jonathan exhaled slowly, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "No, no twins," he replied, attempting normalcy, though every instinct screamed otherwise. He glanced around, the sterile walls, the bustling nurses, the faint smell of antiseptic. It all seemed to shrink, fade, leaving only the boy. Alex grinned, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and turned his attention back to a nurse wheeling in a tray of therapy materials. Jonathan's eyes lingered, a storm of curiosity and unease churning inside. He had come here for a routine visit, a brief detour in his otherwise controlled life. Yet this small human, frail yet audacious, had unsettled him in ways he could not immediately name. Finally, Jonathan straightened, cleared his throat, and muttered, I should check on some things." His steps were hurried, almost mechanical, yet his gaze kept darting back to Alex. As he walked away, a subtle ache lingered, a prick of recognition, a whisper of something lost, something that had existed long before wealth, power, or status had defined him. Alex, unaware of the seismic impact of their encounter, returned to his small world with a smile, content, and playful. Cinematic imagery emphasized the contrast. Jonathan striding with precision and tension, the echo of polished shoes on linoleum. Alex sitting in sunlight streaming through the window, small and fragile, yet radiating warmth and life. Two lives reflected in one another, paths about to intertwine, worlds about to collide. Jonathan Hayes' office towered over the city like a gleaming monument to his success. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the afternoon sun, but Jonathan barely noticed. His mind replayed the boy's face, Alex, over and over. The same eyes, the same mischievous smile, the vulnerability that no amount of wealth or power could shield. He tried to focus on spreadsheets, quarterly projections, and urgent emails demanding immediate decisions, but the child's image haunted him, like a shadow he could not shake. He remembered his own childhood, the quiet nights in a sparsely furnished apartment, the constant expectation to excel, to perform, to become someone who mattered. His parents had loved him in their way, but their love was conditional. Grades, achievements, success. Loneliness had been a constant companion. And now, seeing Alex, so small, so fragile, Jonathan was forced to confront memories he had long buried. The fear, the longing, the sense that the world demanded more than he could ever give. Meanwhile, news from the hospital arrived via his assistant. Alex had taken a turn for the worse. Minor complications, but enough to warrant concern. Jonathan felt a pang that no corporate crisis had ever provoked. He was used to urgency and control, yet here control slipped through his fingers. For the first time, he realized that some things, life, health, human connection, were not metrics he could manage or manipulate. At night, Jonathan sat alone in his penthouse. The city sprawled below him in a lattice of lights, but the glow felt cold and distant. He thought of Alex lying in a hospital bed, his small body fighting battles Jonathan could neither fix nor ignore. He replayed their encounter, the boy's playful words, his innocent gaze, the uncanny resemblance that made Jonathan feel both awe and unease. A subtle tension gnawed at him. The man he had always been, driven by ambition, strategy, and power, versus the man he could become, capable of empathy, connection, and perhaps redemption. For the first time, Jonathan felt a quiet discomfort with his own life choices. Profit margins, boardroom victories, and accolades seemed hollow against the vivid, fragile humanity represented by Alex. By the following morning, Jonathan was restless. He called his assistant under the guise of hospital follow-ups, but the real reason was not protocol or obligation. It was curiosity, concern, and the stirrings of a conscience long neglected. He found himself walking the hospital corridors again, purposeful yet hesitant, heart racing with anticipation and unease. Every step brought him closer to Alex, and with each step, Jonathan felt the weight of two worlds converging, his life of dominance and the boy's world of vulnerability. The rising conflict was no longer abstract, it was personal. Wealth, power, and success had never felt so fragile, and for the first time, Jonathan sensed that transformation was possible, even inevitable. Jonathan Hayes stepped into Alex's hospital room, the soft hum of the machines a reminder of fragility he rarely encountered in his life of precision and control. The boy looked up, eyes lighting at the sight of a familiar figure, not the stern, distant adult he had often known, but someone curious, hesitant, and unexpectedly kind. "Morning, Alex," Jonathan said, his voice softer than he expected. He shifted uncomfortably in the chair by the bed, unused to sitting, unused to stillness. "Good morning, mister," Alex replied with a grin that seemed to illuminate the room, frail as he was. "Did you bring stories?" Jonathan nodded, pulling a small stack of children's books from his briefcase. Titles with colorful illustrations and fantastical adventures seemed almost foreign against the sterile backdrop of white walls and humming machines. Alex's laughter filled the room as Jonathan read aloud, exaggerating voices, stumbling over words, and for the first time in years, allowing himself to be imperfect. Between chapters, Jonathan found himself listening, really listening, to the boy's observations about the world. The way sunlight hit the hospital floor, how the janitor hummed a tune while cleaning, how other kids reacted to nurses with fear or excitement. Alex noticed details Jonathan had long ignored, subtle acts of humanity that no boardroom or corporate report could quantify. "Did you ever build a rocket when you were little?" Alex asked, wide-eyed and curious. Jonathan paused, surprised. I tried," he admitted, "but I usually got frustrated if it didn't work." Alex tilted his head. "I like things that don't work. You can try again. Sometimes things are better the second time." A warmth spread through Jonathan's chest, one unfamiliar and almost alarming. He realized he had spent decades measuring success by speed, efficiency, and results, rarely by persistence, empathy, or joy. Alex's simple philosophy, failure as lesson, kindness as practice, began to chip away at the walls Jonathan had built around his heart. Later, they walked the hospital corridor together, Jonathan carefully guiding Alex's small frame. Each step was a visual contrast. The CEO, immaculate and commanding, moving in a sterile, fluorescent-lit world. The boy, fragile yet full of life, giggling at the little things. A stray paper airplane stuck to the ceiling, a nurse dancing to a tune on her phone. Laughter echoed against linoleum floors in a way that reminded Jonathan of mornings he had missed with his own family, of playful afternoons long buried under work and ambition. At one point, Alex tugged Jonathan toward a window overlooking the city. "Look," he said, pointing. "All those lights, do you think they have kids like me in them?" Jonathan gazed out, the skyline now soft, almost magical through the lens of Alex's wonder. He realized the magnitude of what he had been missing: life outside contracts, wealth, and control. Moments of genuine connection, laughter, and empathy, things he had long dismissed as secondary, suddenly seemed essential. They returned to the room, where Alex's energy softened as he climbed back into bed. Then, in a quiet, innocent voice, he asked the question Jonathan hadn't anticipated. "Do you have a family who hugs you before bed?" Jonathan froze, the words cutting deeper than any boardroom critique. His throat tightened. Memories of a distant childhood, absent father, overbearing mother, and neglected siblings surged forward. The life he had built, powerful as it was, had left gaps that no fortune could fill. I used to," Jonathan said carefully, his voice low, "but it's been a long time." Alex's eyes, wide and unjudging, met his. "I think everyone deserves a hug before bed, even grown-ups." The simplicity of the statement, the purity of the belief, left Jonathan silent. He realized he had been chasing everything that could be counted: money, titles, influence, but had ignored the things that could not: love, connection, empathy, presence. In that quiet moment, surrounded by machines, sunlight, and the soft rhythm of hospital life, a transformation had begun. Jonathan Hayes, the overbearing, controlling CEO, was learning to slow down, to listen, to feel. He was beginning to understand that power without humanity was hollow, and that even the smallest life, like Alex's, could teach lessons larger than any corporate victory. Jonathan Hayes sat beside Alex's hospital bed, a quiet weight pressing on his chest. The boy had drifted into a light nap, small breaths rising and falling like waves. Jonathan's mind wandered, replaying memories of his own childhood, the lonely evenings, the absence of warmth, the countless moments when guidance or affection had been missing. He thought of Alex, so vibrant despite frailty, and a sudden, inexplicable feeling clawed at his chest. This child wasn't just any patient. A nurse approached quietly, holding a medical chart. "Mr. Hayes, I think you should see this." She placed the folder in front of him. Jonathan frowned, skimming the documents. His eyes widened as he read a line that made the world tilt. Alex's full name, his middle name, his mother's name, Jonathan's sister, whom he hadn't seen or contacted in over a decade. The truth hit him like a freight train. Alex was his nephew, a long-lost piece of family he had neglected, a child whose life had unfolded without the guidance, protection, or love he might have provided. Jonathan's fingers trembled as he traced the lines of Alex's chart, then slowly lifted the boy's small hand in his own. The resemblance was uncanny. Eyes that mirrored his own, the same mischievous smile, the same subtle tilt of the head when curious or uncertain. Cinematic close-up. The camera lingers on their hands, Jonathan's large, calloused fingers enveloping Alex's tiny, fragile ones. His breath catches. Every boardroom victory, every contract, every accolade suddenly feels hollow compared to the gravity of this moment. He had spent decades shaping empires, controlling outcomes, and climbing ladders. But here, confronted with family, innocence, and vulnerability, he felt powerless in the most profound sense. Why didn't anyone tell me?" Jonathan whispered, voice tight, almost breaking. His eyes brimmed with emotions long suppressed. Guilt, regret, awe, and an overwhelming urge to protect this child at all costs. Alex stirred, blinking sleepily, and looked at Jonathan. You're like me," he said softly. "My uncle, right?" Jonathan's throat tightened. "Yes," he managed, voice breaking. I should have been here sooner." The room seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the two of them in a cocoon of light and fragile connection. The machines beeped softly, a rhythmic reminder of the stakes, yet Jonathan felt something shift deep within him. The child before him wasn't just a patient. He was a chance for redemption, a mirror reflecting the man Jonathan had once been and the man he could still become. He held Alex's hand tighter, and in that grasp he silently promised he would not allow absence or neglect to define their relationship. This was the moment to act, not as a CEO, not as a strategist, but as an uncle, a guardian, a human capable of love, empathy, and guidance. The power he wielded in boardrooms suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the influence he could have in shaping this young life. Tears threatened but did not fall. Instead, they transformed into resolve. Jonathan made a vow to be present, to nurture, to protect, to teach, and to listen. The life he had led so far, focused on ambition and control, had left gaps too wide to ignore. But here, in the quiet hospital room, he realized that transformation was possible, that one life, even late in the game, could make everything else worthwhile. Jonathan Hayes moved through the hospital with a newfound purpose. Gone was the rigid, commanding posture that dominated boardrooms. In its place was a careful attentiveness, a quiet patience. He met with doctors not to assert authority, but to understand Alex's care plan, asking questions with genuine concern. He offered to fund additional therapies, not as a transaction, but as a gesture of love and commitment. Montage: Jonathan helps a nurse organize therapy equipment, gently assists a child with exercises, shares a laugh with hospital staff. Each action is small but deliberate, a stark contrast to the years he spent asserting dominance over others. In the cafeteria, he quietly buys breakfast for janitors and nurses, offering smiles and words of encouragement rather than orders. The staff, once wary of his presence, now respond with warmth, surprised by the humility in a man they had only known as ruthless. At Alex's bedside, Jonathan reads stories, plays quiet games, and listens, not as a CEO, but as a guardian, an uncle, a human finally learning to connect. He notices the small victories, Alex finishing a therapy exercise, laughing at a joke, showing curiosity about the world. The boy's resilience mirrors Jonathan's own past, and he feels both pride and sorrow for the time lost. The visual contrast is striking. Jonathan in a hospital gown casually tossing a paper airplane with Alex, sunlight glinting off their mirrored features, versus the image of him in a boardroom, sharp suit, sharp gaze, and steel authority. These moments humanize him, proving transformation is not only possible but profound. Gradually, Alex's health stabilizes. He walks with assistance, his laughter filling corridors that once seemed sterile and oppressive. Jonathan watches, a soft smile tugging at his lips, knowing his presence has made a difference, not just in Alex's life, but in his own. The hospital courtyard glowed in the warm light of late afternoon, sunlight spilling across the brick paths and blooming flower beds. Jonathan Hayes walked slowly beside Alex, matching his small, careful steps. The boy's laughter rang clear and unguarded, a melody Jonathan hadn't realized he'd been missing all his life. With each shared smile, each gentle nudge or playful comment, Jonathan felt an unfamiliar lightness, as though decades of stress and ambition were finally melting away. They paused on a bench, Alex pointing out a butterfly fluttering across the garden. Jonathan smiled, noticing the little things he had long ignored. The way sunlight danced on leaves, the subtle scent of flowers carried by the breeze, the hum of life continuing quietly and beautifully beyond his boardroom walls. For the first time, he understood what mattered, not contracts, not profit margins, not accolades, but connection, presence, and empathy. Later in Alex's hospital room, they read together in companionable silence. Alex leaned against Jonathan, small fingers gripping a well-worn storybook, eyes wide with wonder. Jonathan's voice softened with each word, and he found himself pausing, laughing at the boy's small jokes, marveling at his resilience. The sterile hospital walls seemed to vanish, replaced by warmth, intimacy, and a shared sense of belonging. Cinematic imagery emphasized their bond. Sunlight streaming through blinds, highlighting mirrored features, close-ups of fingers intertwined over book pages, soft focus on laughter, eyes sparkling with joy. The contrast was striking. Jonathan, once defined by power and distance, now gentle, present, fully human. The audience senses that this connection is permanent, an anchor for the man who had been lost in ambition for so long. As the sun began to dip behind the city skyline, painting the courtyard in golden-orange hues, Jonathan gazed out over the horizon. He reflected on life's true wealth: love, integrity, compassion, and the courage to change. He realized that the boy, his nephew, his mirror, his teacher, had given him a gift far greater than any corporate victory: perspective, humility, and the chance to rebuild his own humanity. Evening fell softly, and Jonathan gently guided Alex back to the room, hands brushing as they walked. There was no fanfare, no dramatic proclamation, just quiet understanding, the kind that lingers long after the moment has passed. For Jonathan, the hospital, once a place of sterile routines and unease, had become a sanctuary of growth, laughter, and hope. Jonathan Hayes stepped out of St. Mary's Hospital as the evening sky burned with hues of gold, pink, and purple. The city sprawled before him, alive with movement, yet for the first time in decades, the world felt less like a chessboard and more like a place of possibilities. His tailored suit, once a symbol of power and control, now seemed almost secondary to the warmth settling in his chest. He walked slowly, deliberately, carrying with him a lesson that money, influence, and accolades could never teach. True wealth is measured in empathy, connection, and the courage to care. Behind him, Alex waved from the hospital courtyard, his small hand reaching toward Jonathan. The boy's smile was radiant, innocent, and unburdened by the complexities of the world. Jonathan paused, letting the moment sink in, their bond, fragile yet profound, symbolizing hope, transformation, and the power of human kindness. The resemblance between them was no longer uncanny. It was a bridge, a mirror of what Jonathan had been and what he could become. A slow, reflective voiceover fills the scene. We spend our lives chasing success, believing that wealth or power defines us. But sometimes it takes the smallest, most unexpected person to show us what truly matters. Compassion, presence, and love, these are the currencies of a meaningful life. And even the hardest hearts can change when touched by innocence, vulnerability, and trust. Jonathan's footsteps echoed against the quiet streets as he moved away from the hospital. Each step was deliberate, grounded, and thoughtful. No longer the overbearing CEO who demanded respect and obedience, he was a man transformed, aware that redemption is possible, that choices can ripple through lives, and that genuine connection can heal both giver and receiver. Cinematic imagery reinforces the closure. The golden sunset reflecting off glass windows, Jonathan's silhouette framed against the city skyline, Alex's wave lingering in the distance, soft light catching both their faces. The hospital, once a symbol of sterility and anxiety, now represented life, growth, and new beginnings. Music swells softly, piano notes mingling with subtle strings, underscoring the emotional resonance and universal significance of the story. The camera lingers briefly on Jonathan's reflective gaze, then pans to Alex's joyful expression, a silent promise of continuity and hope. The story closes not with dramatic fanfare, but with quiet fulfillment, a reminder that transformation is possible at any age, in any circumstance, and that the heart has infinite capacity for change.